Welcome to Pixels, where we explore the heart and art of photography. I am so glad that you decided to join me today. In this episode, we cover a lot of ground, including the importance of feedback and the value of entering competitions, the tension between authenticity and AI, and the creative lessons that can be learned when we push ourselves both mentally and physically in pursuit of our photography. I'm happy to welcome Matt Payne as today's guest. Matt is a mountain climber and fine art, nature, and landscape photographer living in Durango, Colorado. In 2018, Matt completed his lifelong goal of climbing the highest 100 mountains in Colorado, where his love of photography was kindled. Since 2017, Matt has hosted a weekly podcast dedicated to nature photography called F-Stop and Collaborate and Listen. Matt is also the co-founder of Nature First Photography, an organization that was created in 2018 to help increase ethical awareness in nature photography. Lastly, Matt is the co-creator of the Natural Landscape Photography Awards, an international photography competition which rewards and celebrates nature photographers who dedicate themselves to photographing and editing their work in a realistic fashion. In 2023, Matt thru-hiked the 500-mile Colorado Trail as a photographer while climbing 30 peaks along the way, earning his trail nickname, Extra Credit. A special thank you to Nature Photography Classes and their Inspired Creator Grant, which is a supporter of this channel. You can learn more or submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspiredcreator. Let us know in the comments what you found useful or interesting in this conversation with Matt. Your likes and shares are welcome, and I encourage you to subscribe so that you always are notified of future episodes. And if you are listening to this on an audio-only format, you can visit the YouTube channel, which is called Pixels, or go to pixelspodcast.com to view the images that Matt and I reference during this episode. Hey, Matt, welcome to Pixels. I am so excited to be talking with you today.
Yeah, the feeling is mutual. I am so glad that TJ Thorne made a connection between us.
Yeah, master connector. So I'm so happy to have made your acquaintance. And I'm curious, I've already introduced you, and we know that you've had quite the artistic journey. And I'm curious about what your current direction is. And this gets to a pivot pixels question that I ask, but kind of how your vision and your preferences have changed over time.
Yeah, it's something I like to talk about a lot on my own podcast. And, when I first got into landscape photography, it was through mountain climbing. So all of my photographs were from the summits of mountains and these huge vistas and beautiful light. And, I was like the guy that every single photo I posted was like a 360-degree panorama. Like that's what I was into back then. And, that's beautiful and fun and awesome. And I still like to do that on occasion. But as you mentioned, our preferences do shift over time. And I think that's what I love the most about photography as a pursuit is that if you allow it to, it can kind of feed your creative soul pretty much for the rest of your life if you are open to change and reinterpretation and finding new inspirations and things of that nature. So I definitely have made a very, very strong shift towards more intimate, smaller scene type images. But I do still love seeking out those grand scenics as well. But I'm much, much more open to having conversations with the landscape to discover smaller little snippets and things that just catch my attention. And I would say that's largely driven by curiosity. And, simply put, my process nowadays is I will just take a hike through the woods or the forest or on the side of a mountain. And if I see something that catches my attention, that usually means there's possibly a photograph to be made somehow. Mm-hmm. And so I'll play around with that subject for a while, see if it works or doesn't work, make some images and really lean into that. And through that process, one of my favorite things to do is to look for patterns and shapes and metaphors if I can, things like that. So that's really what's kind of driving my creative process today. And then I would say one of the things I would love to do in the future is have a more intentional shift towards telling longer form stories about the connection between nature and well-being through photography. But that's a whole other conversation, I think.
Well, it's interesting you just ended with the word conversation, because that's the word that just jumped out at me as you were sharing your journey, talking about being in conversation with nature, conversation with the landscape. It strikes me that that's I hate to put it this way, but it's sort of a mature wisdom perspective, because when we first start out, I don't know that we think of it that way. We're just like, oh, that's epic, and that sort of thing. Would you say just a little bit about, like, when you say conversation with nature or the landscape, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I guess you could take that in a couple directions, right? I mean, there's the technical side of like literally what happens. It's like I notice something, I explore it visually, or even using other senses as well. Like, oh, what is it smelling like?
Mm-hmm.
What is the wind doing? Things like that. And then I'm observing it. I'm trying to understand it. I'm trying to. Oftentimes, it's driven by curiosity, like of natural processes. For example, if I see a reflection on a lake that's glittering, but the glittering is moving, I'm like, why is that happening? Oh, it's because the wind is blowing and the water's changing. Like, I'm trying to understand the physics of what's happening in front of me. And so oftentimes I'm like, oh, I'm understanding what's happening here now. How can I leverage that understanding towards making an image? So that's more the technical side. I
Mm-hmm.
think on the less technical side, the more woo woo side, I guess, for lack of a better term, is I really just want to satiate my curiosity and extend my love affair of nature in a way that honors the subject, and also hopefully the goal is for me to put my own kind of stamp on it. Like, there's a reason why I noticed it and maybe two other people didn't notice it. And likewise, there's a reason why they're noticing stuff that I don't notice, because they're their own person. And so I'm always trying to find ways to differentiate myself as a photographer by um, leveraging trust in myself and honoring what I actually find interesting in nature. So I don't know if that makes sense or not, but that's kind of
Oh,
where my
yeah.
brain goes.
Yeah, and I think it might even come to life. If it's all right with you, I'd love to share some of your images,
Sure.
and take a look at what you're describing as you're talking about these conversations.
So that was actually photographed on a workshop that I was leading past summer, up in the mountains of Colorado. And it was probably 2 in the afternoon, right? And we were camped at these high mountain lakes. And what I noticed is that there was this kind of like pond scum growing on the lake itself, which is that those bright things in the edges that are glowing like that. But then I was
Mm-hmm.
noticing that the wind was kind of blowing through, and these little glimmers of light would kind of catch the surface. And I was using my 100 to 400 lens to really dial in and get a slice of what I was seeing. And it felt to me like those little, I mean, it's literally, they're just diffraction spikes, right, from the lens. But I
Mm-hmm.
thought they looked like ships passing through a canal or something like that. So I just liked the kind of little metaphor that I was seeing there. The what else is it? That's something I learned from Colleen Minnick way back when I had her on
Mm-hmm.
my podcast. Is when you photograph stuff, like, don't just photograph it for what it is, but photograph it for what else it could be. So
Mm.
I like to try to do that in a lot of my images as well. And again, it's not epic, right? Like, it's just pond scum and some light glittering on a lake.
But it depends on how we're defining epic, and if we define it as deeply meaningful in some way, or you know, I think we're traditionally thinking of like that grand landscape, right? And this is more of that small scene that captured your eye. And I love that story, and what Colleen shared. Any other images in here that feel like they're
Yeah.
calling to us?
So let's see here. There's another image that I photographed when I was in Colorado this last fall. It's called Lone Holdout. I knew that it was going to snow the night before like I photographed this image, so I was really excited to see how the landscape was going to be transformed by a winter weather storm that moved in. And so as soon as the light even started to get at all, I was hurried up. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just got in my car and I started driving around looking for scenes. And I saw this single aspen tree just kind of like in this field of other aspen trees by itself with blowing snow crossing the face of it. And for me, it just spoke to me. And it shouted at me. I was like, you need to come over here and photograph me. This is a really incredible scene. And I just loved the way that the other trees around it kind of helped anchor the scene. And I like the story that it tells. Like this is like the lone holdout. It's like it's surviving the elements, and then you've got those other little saplings at the bottom that are, just trying to hold on. So, for me, I just like the story that particular photograph tells about the resilience of nature, and of course, that can translate over into, we can um, attach ourselves to that as well in terms of things we've gone through in our own lives and whatnot. So
As I'm looking at those yellow leaves, I keep seeing what looks like a skirt that's sort of blowing in the wind. That makes me
right. See, that's what's fun. Like you might see something in the image that I totally don't see at all, and that's what's really fun about this type of photography.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other ones before?
There's an image called Lake Growth. I actually photographed that on my Colorado Trail through hike this summer. And as I was hiking along the trail, I noticed off to my right, and this was probably like at 10 in the morning or something. I noticed off to my right, there was a lake. It was a very small lake with a beaver dam at the front of it. And there was all of this grass just growing on the top of the lake surface in all of these weird patterns going in all these different directions. And it was actually one of the few times on the whole trip that I got my tripod out because I was like, well, I got to focus stack this scene because this is too cool to pass up. And I spent probably a good 30 minutes trying to make sense of the best part of the scene to capture. And I only had one lens with me. I had a Tamron 28 to 200. So I think I was probably all the way out at 200 trying to get as much detail in the grasses as I could. But again, that's just something I've grown to notice as I'm hiking. If I see something that's unusual, usually that means that there's a photograph in there somewhere. So I just try to stick to that instinct and pull something out of it.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that through hike that you were just describing and what you experienced and learned from that.
If people want like a full breakdown of the entire trip, I did a whole podcast episode about it. But basically, Colorado Trail is about a 500-mile hike. I did it in a 35-day period. And I decided to do the harder part, which is called the Collegiate West version, which has more elevation gain. And then, of course, I don't know, it's just the way I'm wired, but I also wanted to challenge myself even further by bringing my photography equipment and challenge myself even more so by climbing 30 mountains along the way. So basically, I just kind of thought of it as a feather in the cap. Like it's something that I knew that I wouldn't probably be able to do very often in my lifetime. I had the perfect window to be able to do it. And I wanted to use it as a way to kind of challenge myself physically and mentally. I've never been by myself for that long before. And so, there's a lot of logistics to go into doing the Colorado Trail. And so the whole challenge of it just appealed to me significantly. I went into the hike with some pretty purposeful intent of trying to leverage that alone time to use it as a way to just think and give myself time to be alone in nature and allow that time to inspire me to write down ideas, to think about different subjects. And so every day as I was hiking, I would talk into my phone with different notes that I had about ideas I wanted to explore through video. And then every night I would then set up my camera and tripod and record a video of me talking about whatever that subject was. And then as the trip got further and further along, I was like, oh, this stuff is actually kind of interesting and cool. Maybe I could do a book project that explores these topics further while using some of my photography to tie in some of the messaging. And so now I've given myself another project out of that to write a book about stuff. So that's essentially what the Colorado Trail was for me. It's almost like a retreat with nature that led to all kinds of interesting pathways and connections inside of my brain. So hopefully that yields some other results down the road. But for anyone who hasn't done something similar for yourself, I highly encourage you to take that space, because I think a lot of really interesting stuff can come out of it.
Yeah. What surprised you the most from that experience?
Honestly, what surprised me the most is how my body was able to physically overcome the challenge. And I averaged about 18 miles a day of hiking, and oftentimes you're gaining 3 to 7,000 feet of elevation in that time period, sometimes more. And by a weekend, my body was like, just like, let's go, bring it, let's keep going, and it just felt really good to, because I'm 45, so I'm not like a 25-year-old kid running up and down these mountains. There's, so it's a little bit harder on you when you're this age, but I was really surprised with just the physical capability that I was able to muster for the hike.
Yeah.
That's kind of a boring answer, but
No, I get it, because I went to Death Valley for the first time back in January of 2023, and I have had, because I've had hip replacement surgery, but this was before that surgery, and I had a lot of pain, and the physical demands were quite. It was quite a lot for me, in my 51-year-old body, and so. But what surprised me was how I, whether it was smart or not, powered through. What I was capable of, particularly when I felt like I was. It wasn't just I came all this way and I spent money and I need to do it. It was also I am committed. Like I want to be here. I need to be here, and I can do this. And it's no small thing.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing that came out of that, relating to the physical side of all of it, is, and this is going to sound super cheesy and cliche, but I think there's some truth to it. But I felt like the journey I went on could be useful as just a point of inspiration for others, like talking through the challenges that I had to overcome and what all was involved in the process and things like that. And, hopefully that inspires other people to like get off the couch and, start to get exercise, because I think one of the big takeaways I had was, you can have a lot of things in this life, but if you don't have your health, it doesn't really matter that much. So I think we're focusing on our health and well-being including mental health, right? Like that was a big component of it for me. Focusing on those things and improving them, I think, makes just for a much better life experience.
Yeah. And ultimately, it feels like it's a chicken and egg. Does the photography, which feeds the other, the photography or the health and the photography?
Right.
It sounds like those two things are working in tandem for you.
Ideally. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned challenges. What do you feel like was not necessarily with the trip, but it could be with the trip, but what challenges have you encountered on your artistic and creative journey, and how did you move through those?
Yeah, so I would say there's a lot to chew on there.
Mm.
One of the things that I feel like most photographers struggle with is trying to find our own voice in how we
Yes.
see the world and how we put our work out there. And I will be the first to admit that throughout my career, early on, I spent a lot of time emulating other people. And, um, like if I saw something on social media that was bright and shiny and like, oh, that person has so many likes and comments, unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
I should do the same exact thing they're doing. And I think one thing I've learned over the last 6 or 7 years is like that's not really a very satisfying approach. At least for me, it's not. I mean, for someone else, that might you might totally love that, but for
Mm-hmm.
me, I found that approach to making images to be, it just wasn't fulfilling. Not only from a photography perspective, but from a ego slash feeling accomplished perspective. Like I don't know. It's hard for me. For me. It's hard to be proud about something that isn't actually mine, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't something that I came up with. I'm just copying what somebody else did. So um, I struggled a lot with that, and in fact, 2016 ish, 2017, early 2017, I was really close to quitting photography. I was on a hiking trip in fall, and I was doing the same old thing. I was finding compositions that other people had photographed and going to those exact spots, photographing those exact same scenes. And of course, the light wasn't the same of what those people got, and the scene wasn't anywhere near what those people experienced, and it was a huge letdown. And I just remember feeling really demoralized with
Mm.
photography at that moment, and I started driving my car towards leaving the area I was in, and I saw this trailhead. And I was like, I've never hiked that trail. I don't even know what's at the end of that trail, but I do know that I love hiking, and that's how I got into photography to begin with. So what the heck? Let's just hike this trail and see what I find. And I hiked way up this trail. It was like 1,500 feet of elevation gain in 3 miles. It's pretty steep.
Mm. Yeah.
But it brought me to the top of this mesa. Um, and at the edge of this mesa was this obscured overlook of the entire scene around me that included several mountains that I've climbed and these huge valleys full of aspen trees that were changing and snow-capped peaks and dramatic
Mm.
clouds. And I was just like, yes, this is what I need to get back to, is just exploring and being open. And so that was like a really pivotal moment for me in terms of finding my confidence again as a photographer. And it was all around just letting go of what I should be doing, what other people
Yeah.
are doing, and just doing my thing.
Yeah. I think it's Ralph Waldo Emerson quote, comparison is the thief of joy.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and inevitably inevitably when we're spending so much time looking and copying others and looking for those same scenes, we are end up comparing. Like you said, I didn't have the same scenes, so I was disappointed. And
Well, and that
it
relates
seemed,
to so many
yeah,
parts of life, right? Like I think
yeah.
about my mountain climbing accomplishments. Like if I were to compare myself to some of the people I know that have climbed a million more mountains than I have, like that might be, and
Hmm.
that might feel like I didn't do anything. But you just have to let that stuff go and just focus on what you're proud of for yourself and what you are drawn to, and just leverage that, lean into that, and don't worry about what other people are doing. Like appreciate what other
Hmm.
people are doing, like find inspiration in what other people are doing,
Yeah.
but don't compare yourself to other people because they're not you. There's only one
Right.
you, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It makes another quote, be yourself, everyone else is already taken. And I can't remember who said that one, but it's
That's perfect.
it's another good one. It's another good one.
That's
Well,
yeah.
what you're
That's
saying here, I feel like I could ask this of every guest, because it's such a through line for talking about one's relationship to photography, and that is do what you're drawn to, what you like, and don't worry about what other people think. And it feels like there's a yes and to that, because it depends on your goals for photography, right? If you are someone who is looking to be professional, or if you're really driven by that sharing community around stuff, you're also thinking, what will other people like? Have you felt that tension? And it sounds like maybe you have, but what's your experience or reaction to that tension?
Yeah, I mean, it's especially problematic when you start thinking about selling prints, right? Or
Yeah.
entering competitions, or really any
Yes.
venue where other people are looking at your photography and evaluating it on some basis, right? And so
Yeah.
for me, there is kind of always a little bit of a voice in the back of my head that's like, oh, that would probably make a pretty nice print. And I don't let that voice drive my behavior a whole lot. I just let it remind me on occasion, like, hey, by the way, that could probably make a good photograph that people might buy. You should take it. And that I'll go with that, but I don't let it drive, where I go, the things I photograph. It's more of just if it's there, cool, go for it. But I'm not going to let that dictate. Relating to that relationship between just doing it for yourself and only caring about what you think about your photography versus putting a lot of thought and stock into external validation. I do think for me, it's important that some of my friends and or trusted peers or other photographers that I admire find appreciation in some of the photography that I do. Mostly because those are photographers that I like. And if I'm creating images that they find interesting, that means that I am following my path that I want to be on. And I'm not always letting that drive everything either. It's more of just a subtle kind of thing, like, oh, I wonder if so-and-so would like this image. And so I do have those voices, but I don't let them drive me too very much. What I will say, though, is that I do seek out feedback from trusted peers on images before I post them. Not always, but if there's any uncertainty in an image, I'll send it to 3 or 4 of my friends and ask them what they think about it. And almost always they catch something that I missed, or like, oh, have you thought about cropping it this way, or things like that. So I think it is helpful to bounce things off of external points of view, but I don't think you should let external points of view drive all of your behavior.
So what I hear is, like, if you can have a healthy relationship, if you can form a feedback loop that feels like it's generative or nurturing to your own growth and supportive of your vision. I doubt when you send an image to some of those peers that they're like, what are you thinking? It's much more constructive and supportive,
Most
and
of the
gives you
time,
that extra perspective.
I definitely have a really close friend of mine that I'll send him stuff and he's like, that's terrible. Like, you messed up the processing. It's
So maybe they
awful.
do
But
say, what were you thinking?
yeah, and it's like he can do that because I'll do the same
Yeah.
thing to him and it's fine. But I actually, most of the time, if that's his initial reaction, I know that, yeah, I missed the boat, and so that's, I take it with a little bit of a grain of salt. But yeah, I think a healthy relationship with fostering your growth as a photographer, as an artist, using external points of reference to gain confidence, to get that feedback loop. I think that is a useful part of the process of growing as a photographer. I know we're going to talk a little bit about competitions at the end of the end of this, but I think competitions is an interesting foray into that particular topic, because as a competition organizer myself, I have a fairly nuanced opinion about the role of competitions in photography. Um, I think, first of all, not all competitions are created equal. I mean, there's some competitions you submit
Hmm.
a photo, who knows if anyone even looked at it. You don't get
Yeah.
any feedback on the image. Some of the images that win, you're just like, wow, there's all kinds of problems with that photo.
Hmm.
So I
Hmm.
wanted to create a competition that elevated work that maybe wasn't as shouty, wasn't as loud, um, where it was clear that the photographer had to bring something to the table of themselves that kind of differentiates them from the rest of the participants. And then also, I wanted to provide mechanisms for feedback to people, like, here's how you are comparing to the rest of your peers.
Yeah.
So we give out, we're not talking about the Natural Landscape Photography Awards, but everyone who enters gets a certificate that shows how their image was evaluated by the judges. Um, and then we also do critique sessions of entrance work that give us permission to, and we put them on YouTube, basically,
Hmm.
so that we can give people feedback on how to improve and how to, make changes to their approaches to photography, that might help them do better in the future in the competition. With that being said, competitions and judges are looking often for things a little bit differently than perhaps what the general public might be looking for. So it's
Yeah.
important to look to see who the judges are and see, like, oh, does their how they do photography relate to the way that I see the world? And so I think, there's a lot of subjectivity within that. But I think if you look at the judging panel and you say, oh, those are some people I highly admire, I like their work, it would be nice
Hmm.
to see what they think about my work. So I think that's an important distinction
Yeah.
to make when it comes to competitions.
I entered the or the Natural Landscape Photography Awards last year. It was my first time entering, and I had one image that made it to the raw review phase.
Oh, cool.
Um, and I was excited about that. I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. But what was cooler was that follow up afterwards with, like you said, here's how your image ranked, sort of, and that feedback, and then finding that video on YouTube with the critiques and suggestions. I thought, this is a valuable service.
Right.
This is something that is supporting people in growing in their art form, because the criticism I hear sometimes about, like, competitions, oh, it's a money grab from the
Right.
on the part of the organizers or something. And so I think that it's important, like you said, to be very discerning about looking at what are the sort of underlying intentions of that
Right.
competition, or you know because it can be I see it as a way to step back and look at my images differently,
Yes.
and really turn a different eye, to them.
Yeah. No, I'm
And
the
that's
same way.
valuable.
In fact, I just entered another competition a couple of days ago, and I spent like 2 or 3 hours going through my images and trying to figure out what would make sense to submit. And it does make you look more closely at your
Hmm.
photography, if you're taking it seriously, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so from that perspective, it does give you another layer of kind of, okay, should I be entering this image? And is there anything with this
Hmm.
image that might give a judge pause? So I think
Right.
if you approach it from the right perspective, it can make you a better photographer.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'll just say really quickly before moving on, the other valuable part of the exercise for me is going back to past competition winners
Hmm.
and reviewing those images and looking at them and thinking, okay, what about that image probably set it apart or gave it that edge or made it stand out? That's interesting too. And to see some images where I'm like, I have no idea why that image is there. But then
Right.
that forces me to think, okay, what am I missing maybe? And to remember, this is highly, yes, there are some objective things that I'm sure that are being looked for, but at the end of the day, it's highly subjective. And to remember that, just to help keep perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. You talked about inspiration a few minutes ago, and I'm curious where your inspiration comes from, and or how you create it when you're not finding it.
Mm. Well, I have really good news for you, Beth, because you've just embarked on this journey of podcasting, at least on the photography side of things. I know you've done other podcasts in the past, but um, one of the biggest gifts that I gave myself, and it was not even on purpose, but I've come to retrospectively realize is that, I've started my podcast in 2017. I've had over 300 people on my show, and some of them are the photographers that I personally find the most interesting or admirable in terms of their work or just the way they think about photography. And so um, I draw a lot of inspiration from the guests that I have on my podcast and trying to get a feel for the way that they see the world. I'm always borrowing little bits and pieces from what people say, or things that they talk about in terms of their field craft, or how they think about color theory, or what are they looking for in terms of what makes an interesting composition. So I'm constantly drawing on that body of knowledge that I've given myself over the last 6 or 7 years through the podcast. And then of course there's a number of photographers that I have looked to for inspiration over the last 4 or 5 years that have really helped me grow as a photographer, many of which you've probably either already had or will have on the podcast here. Alex Noriega is one of my favorite photographers. Guy Tal, maybe not so much for his photography, but the way that he thinks about the world that we live in and how that intersects with our photography. I really appreciate the way his brain works. And so that's another one. Sarah Marino and her partner, Ron Cascarosa, are good examples of people that have adopted a lot of their shooting style in terms of being much more reactive and, slowing down and having more of a conversation with the landscape versus like trying to dominate the landscape and take from the landscape. Those are the big ones that come to my mind. There's tons and tons of other people too, like William Neal, and I mean the list goes on and on. But definitely, my podcast has helped me grow immensely as a photographer.
Yeah. Yeah, it feels like it's almost I'm doing this for somewhat selfish reasons because it's this opportunity to really connect with people that you respect and admire, while also giving something that's valuable. Excuse me.
Right, exactly. It's a win-win-win. Ideally.
Yeah, it's a win-win-win. Yeah, ideally,
Yeah.
exactly. I love that. And so I'm going to shift gears for just a moment to kind of photography in general and its future. What place does it hold in creative expression, especially when we consider the rise of AI and photo manipulation to new degrees that we haven't seen before. What's in your crystal ball, I guess, about where things are going?
Well, I think what we're seeing, especially with the advent of AI, is that there is a strong thirst and hunger for authenticity in photography, not only in terms of what we're being presented, having an honest depiction or caption that accompanies it, that represents what that photographer actually witnessed, but also in terms of authenticity as it relates to someone's connection with photography and what they're using photography for, in terms of their personal journey in life. So a good example is like TJ Thorne using photography as like a mechanism to overcome his struggles with depression and substance abuse. I mean, I think that's a fantastic example of what I mean by authenticity. And interestingly enough, like TJ and I are like at the opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to that debate on, photorealism and all that stuff. But I highly respect his approach to photography and the way he talks about photography and the way he uses it to kind of just live life, like that. It's a vehicle through which he's using it to express himself. I think also what we're seeing because of AI is there's a lot more hunger for people to have trust in what they're looking at.
Yeah.
And obviously, I've somewhat doubled down on that with the Natural Landscape Photography Awards and the rules that we've
Mm-hmm.
created for what is admissible in our competition. But I think that's when I look at my Facebook feed, it's full of people complaining about AI, and
Yeah.
talking about how AI isn't photography and how they hate AI and blah 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 blah. And with that, I will say that I think there is a use case for AI in creative expression. I think people might be surprised to hear me say that, but I do think that there's ways to use AI to creatively express yourself. There's a good example. I did a podcast panel discussion on AI with a group of photographers and a copyright lawyer. And one of the
Mm-hmm.
photographers we had on, her name is Diana uh, Nicolette, and she basically, her approach is she takes her own photography, she augments it with AI, and then she does a bunch of stuff in Photoshop to create these stories with her photographs. And so it's like she calls it AI mediated photography. But she's
Mm-hmm.
very open and honest about how the work is created, and I think the end results of the stuff that she's making are pretty interesting. It's not just like typing in a prompt and then sharing the end result that AI spits out. Like she's using it as just another tool to help express what she wants to say. And so I think AI does have a place there. Again, I
Mm-hmm.
think it all comes back to how we talk about our artwork and our photography. I think there's a huge hunger from the public to connect with people about their honest processes and how they talk about the artwork that they're creating. And so I highly encourage other photographers. I mean, if you're doing compositing and AI and all that stuff, knock yourself out, but just be honest with your audience about
Mm-hmm.
what you're doing, why you're doing it. I think that's oftentimes what is missing from the conversation. Why did you decide to stretch the mountain to make it twice the size? Why did you decide to
Mm.
put in a different sky? Why did you decide to do a focal length blend to create a composition? Let's talk about the why of the process so that people can have a better understanding of what you're doing as an artist. Otherwise, people are just going to make up the story for themselves.
Yeah, yeah, you lose control of the message if you had any control in the first place, but you definitely relinquish the story when you aren't forthright about that with your intentions. Um,
Right.
yeah, appreciate that. Appreciate it. One
Along,
last
just real
question.
quick,
Oh,
yeah, just
yeah.
real quick, along those same lines, I think because of that thirst for honesty and authenticity, we're seeing a huge shift, especially from the younger demographics, of just using film cameras. I mean, people are
Yes.
going
Yes.
analog. Like there's a huge shift towards people just saying, I don't trust any photography, and the only photography I can trust is something that was shot on film. And I think that's really interesting to see that backlash as well, especially from a younger generation. So I think
Yeah.
that's evidence that there's a strong desire for people to have that connection with photography as representing real moments or real experiences. And
Hmm.
so, anyway, that's where my brain goes. I could be completely wrong, and every photographer in 10 years is just typing prompts into AI, but I
Oh
doubt it.
no, no.
I doubt
I
it.
doubt it. I hope not. I hope not. Because I could see myself being somebody that would have a lot of fun. I have never tried it. I
Oh, it's
haven't gone
super
on.
fun. It is
I that
fun.
is a blast. And maybe I should do it. So I could see myself doing that. And for me, like photography is it's a wraparound experience, right? As it sounds
Right.
like it is for you. It's not just about what appears on, from the memory card. It is that experience of I woke up super early, I saw the fog or I saw the snow or whatever, and I went out there and it's the hunt for that, or what's calling to you. Like you said, that aspen tree was like, here, come look at me.
Right.
Um, that is a huge part, at least for me, of that joy that I get from photography.
Yeah, and
Um,
I know I've kicked a dead horse so many times on this subject, but I've I've never really understood like people that are super exuberant about nature and having those amazing moments in nature, then taking a photograph they captured and then making it something that completely doesn't represent anything that they
Mm,
experienced, and then
mhm.
presenting it to the world as if it was. And it's like you're lying to yourself, but you're also lying to the world.
Yeah,
Unless you're doing it for an interesting reason. I just don't understand it. I guess that's, I've
yeah.
had people on my podcast to talk about why they do it. I've never really had anyone give me a compelling answer yet. Maybe I'm
Mhm.
just not open minded to it, but anyway, I'll stop kicking.
Well, it just sounds like what you've achieved is some clarity about why you do what you do and what's important to you.
Sure.
And we can and how we react to other people and their choices tells us a lot about what's important to us. So that's kind of what I hear in what you're saying.
Well said. I'm going to use that.
Awesome. Good thing we're recording.
Yes.
Well, um, before I ask you about the Landscape Photography Awards and your podcast, because I want you to tell us just a little bit about how folks can get more information and that. Um, I borrow this from Colleen Minnick, I believe, because I heard her use this phrase creativity cross training like a few years
Mm,
ago. And it really stuck with me because I thought, yeah, what are some ways that we feed our creative expression that don't involve picking up a camera, for instance?
right.
What have you found keeps your creative spirit alive and inspired?
I spend a lot of time listening to podcasts that don't have anything to do with photography. Obviously, I do like other photography podcasts as well, and you can get a lot of creativity cross training through listening to podcasts. Hopefully, that's why people are listening to our podcast. But
Yeah.
I like listening to podcasts about psychology or
Mm,
economics or marketing or I don't know, interesting stories about a murder that didn't get solved, or like that's where I get a lot of inspiration and creative joy. I also really enjoy learning about natural processes. So um,
mm,
maybe watching videos about how like you think about those BBC Nature documentaries, like Attenborough and things like that. Like that's
mhm,
a great way to get some inspiration and some more creative juices flowing. I also really, really like watching film, watching
mhm,
movies. I mean, a great example for me is I'm not sure if you've seen The Revenant, but it's that Leonardo
mhm.
DiCaprio movie. It's incredibly violent, but the cinematography in that movie is just unbelievably good. And so I like watching movies to get ideas about why different scenes work, or why that composition makes sense, or how they leveraged lighting in a certain way to help convey what was happening in that scene. So I think you can get a
Yeah.
lot out of watching movies too.
Absolutely. I just finished watching the series Severance for the second time all the way through.
Okay.
Have you seen that on Apple
I
TV?
think I watched like the first three or four, and then I haven't gotten back into it for some reason. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, it it's one of those that doesn't necessarily like grab you, but the cinematography in it, especially if you love architecture and minimalism,
Hmm.
it is it is brilliant. I mean, it's like every scene I was like paying attention to the story, but I'm just like the framing of things and the effectiveness and noticing what I said to my husband last night was it's like it's so interesting that symmetry and balance can mean calm. Like it's, like we will do something that has that it doesn't tax our brains, but yet somehow when it is presented in the way that they were doing it and it's over and over and over again, and maybe it's the music and everything else too, but there was
Sure.
tension. I thought
Right.
there's this weird paradox of I'm looking at something that typically my brain would respond to with like, whew, but instead I'm feeling this like on the edge of my seat.
Right.
And how does that translate into how I'm looking at the world, especially through my camera?
Yeah. 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 Exactly.
Which podcasts, if you've got some recommendations for us?
So I really like Hidden Brain. It's one of my
Yes.
favorite
Yeah.
podcasts. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology, and I really love
Mm.
social psychology, and that podcast is all about social psychology, but they present it in a way that's really digestible and relatable. And you learn almost
Mhm.
every time you learn something like, oh, that's why I do that. Okay.
Exactly.
You know,
I love
so
it.
so that I
Yeah.
love that podcast. Gosh, I'm trying to think what else I've been listening to. This American Life, I like
Mhm.
occasionally. Radiolab is really good. I love the stories that
Mhm.
they talk about on Radiolab. Again, it's not really creativity, but I can't remember whose quote this is, but maybe it was Brooks Jensen said this, that if you want to make more interesting photographs, become a more interesting person. And I think
Yeah.
by learning about cross disciplines like psychology, philosophy, physics, natural processes, geology, biology, whatever, I think the more that we can feed our brain with that type of stuff,
Mhm.
we become more interesting, and then we start finding things in nature that are more interesting to us, and then that helps, again, that drives that creative process. So it's kind of a circular thing where you keep feeding that side of your brain with more and more information, and then it translates into your photography, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. Brilliant. Love that. Well, tell us as we close here a little bit about your podcast and how we can find it, and the Natural Landscape Photography Awards.
Sure. So my podcast is called F-Stop, Collaborate, and Listen, which I can't take any credit for naming that. My wife came up with the name. It's if you're not born in the 70s or 80s, you might not know that it's a reference to a Vanilla Ice song.
Oh my
um,
goodness. I was born in the 70s, but I didn't know that. I just thought it was clever.
yeah, I mean, stop, collaborate, and listen. You know that song? Anyway.
Oh, okay. Now you
Um,
have to look it up.
Yeah. So anyway, podcast has been around since 2017. I just produced like episode 360 something.
Wow.
Um, I will say that if you haven't tuned in a while because either you can't stand me or I'm repetitive or whatever your reason for not, it's changed a lot in the last 2 years, 3 years. It's gotten better. Format's a little bit cleaner. I'm trying to spend more and more time on production and things of that nature. So if you haven't listened in a while, check it out again, and you might like it better than you did before. Early on, it was very raw, very lots of profanity. Some people really liked that. Some people hated it.
Hmm.
But anyway, that's how you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts, or you can find a link to all that stuff on my website, mattpaynephotography.com. And then Natural Landscape Photography Awards. We typically open up for entries in June and announce our winners sometime in November. So it's a pretty long process for collecting
Hmm.
entries and then going through several iterations of judging, which is incredibly time consuming but worth it. And then we also produce an annual fine art photography book. I have the two of those right
Oh,
there behind
nice.
me on the shelf. And they're not just a collection of winning images, they also contain essays from judges or essays from other people in the industry. And they also have some of our favorite picks from the organizers of
Hmm.
images that we thought were interesting or outstanding. Um, and those are available, and you can learn more about the competition or join our mailing list at naturallandscapephotography.com. Gosh, I think that's it.
Yeah. Well, I'll include links to all of that in the show description, so that it makes it easier for folks to find it. And I personally want to say thank you, and I hope thank you on behalf of anybody who is a nature photographer lover and just photography in general, how much you've contributed to our learning and everything else. Just so much gratitude. So thank you so much, Matt.
Oh, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Let us know in the comments what was most useful or meaningful to you, and be sure to subscribe so that you're notified of future episodes. This channel is made possible in part by nature photography classes and their Inspired Creator Grant. You can learn more or submit your own application at naturephotographyclasses.com/inspiredcreator. Thank you again so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.